second session in a study that is ultimately fixed on unity. Before we do that, I just want to invite you, anytime you don't have another place to land, if you have in-person meetings to get to, please do that. If you don't and are looking for a place on a Sunday to come join us on Zoom, please come join us. We would love to have you, same way you got here tonight. We start at 10:30 on Sunday mornings, and you're always welcome. If you do miss, as Sister Betty has said, she's been away for a couple Tuesdays, and not all of you are with us on Sundays. If you ever want to join by way of watching videos, we post those. We post them on Facebook and YouTube. Facebook will take you to YouTube, but you can also go directly to YouTube. All right, let's get started. And I so enjoyed the discussion and the conversation this evening. I almost feel guilty breaking you away from your interacting to get to class, but I do want to get to class for all of you too, hoping that the Lord has something for you tonight. So having said that, our class is on unity. And we've used a line from a song from the 1980s that some of you may not know. I almost want to say, I hope some of you don't know, because it was just a fun song that played through the radios hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But the line in it was this: stop, collaborate, and listen. And I believe that that is the answer to unity, or at least to finding unity. We're not going to explain that this evening. We're working ourselves to that explanation and to the kind of the how-to with that explanation. But that is our title throughout these next couple weeks: stop, collaborate, and listen. And that singer was someone named Vanilla Ice. And so he had this line within it, and then he promised that if you got a problem, I don't even want to do the line because it sounds so foreign. Anyway, if you got a problem, he would solve it. Now, we know he's not the one to solve that. We know where that solution will come from, but let's move forward. Sorry, some of these are done tongue-in-cheek, and the author enjoys them probably much more than the reader. So I do find great pleasure in those last couple slides or pictures. All right, so last week our theme was unity. On the title of every page, you found this word right where it is right now, centered, and on every page, unity. This week, a little different. This week, instead of the word unity, we're instead going to focus on disunity. Last week, we defined unity as by way of establishing this study's ultimate goals. As we always do on the first week of every study, if it's going to be multiple weeks, we use that first one to create the foundation. We looked, hopefully, I think, towards enjoying unity as an aim. Daunting as it is, still an aim. And while I think even more so coming off of last week, while we maintain a realistic understanding of the difficulty of unity, I believe at the end of last week, most of us were leaning forward into the possibility of such togetherness. For some of us, we have some experience in finding unity, whether that was in a meeting, whether that was in a conference, whether that was in a one-on-one, or even whether that was in a week-long campout. Now, I don't know that anyone would say I sustained unity for an entire week, or I sustained a feeling of unity with the entire body for an entire weekend, but we have some touch to unity. So we're leaning in. As much as I made a case last week for how it's so difficult to find unity in almost any level, in almost any group, and even almost with anybody, I think we still believe. And I hope that was the result of last week, or I hope you came away from last week reinforcing what you already believed. So, having said all of that, I think we also agree that any success that we might have unifying together has to come through God's intervention, because our records are so filled with failure that we understand only God's intervention will get us to some level of unity, and especially if we're going to come in and say some level of sustained unity. The average person, this is what we know, the average person doesn't set out to be contentious. Now, there are people with contentious spirits. Don't miss what I'm saying. But most of us don't come into any situation with an idea that I'm going to be the one who's going to contend against any peace. We don't plan to be the cause, and we don't even think we're going to contribute to creating or causing any disunity. We realize, though, that disunity results in terrible feelings. It results in chaos. It results in stress. It results in misery. And certainly unhappiness. So, why then do we fail so often at establishing unity? We know unity feels better, so why aren't we successful? Why is togetherness in almost any interaction, in almost any relationship, so challenging? Why can't we, as the word says, reason together? Why can't we celebrate oneness? I think one irony, as I was thinking about this today, one irony in establishing this accord that we're looking to establish with us as believers specifically has to do with even the starting point for us in our relationship with God. Now, watch what I mean by that. We celebrate a complete and full buy-in as the secret to our succeeding in maintaining our relationship with Christ. We have to start with so much enthusiasm, so much commitment, so much dedication, so much obligation. 100% of ourselves committed, dedicated, feeling obligated. So we value in each other. We value our decisiveness to make such a critical decision. As I told you in the last study we did, that decision made you experimenting scientists, if you remember, taking a risk on this unseen God. So in order to still be giving until your last breath, if you will, still striving until that last breath is taken, it has to start in full dedication, full commitment. So holding on to those decisions becomes the standard for believers. The plus, the strength, the positive. Does that work against us? That seems to be what I'm saying. As I said, one of the ironies in establishing such oneness is our starting point, which is that 100% commitment. Let's see what I mean. Last week we learned that unity is defined as agreement, harmony, oneness. We learned to find all of these only by surrendering ourselves. We replace natural desires with spiritual requirements. There's a huge shift in our prioritizing from natural wants to spiritual needs. This new norm of our spiritual lives is most often, hear this now, most often determined by a new set of standards. Now this new set of standards becomes our belief system or our beliefs. Now watch this. Oddly, these beliefs can also be the source of disunity. How so, say you? Let's go to the next slide. The paradox of beliefs is the very thing intended to provide peace, provide cohesiveness, can also be a contention creator. This disunity is not simply with other people of differing beliefs, but even at some point, at some level, some type of conflict within us, personally, individually, spiritually. Man finds comfort in clarity. Beliefs are not necessarily clear. Beliefs are not always fact-based, at least in concrete terms. Now, to the believer, beliefs are very fact-based. But beliefs by concrete terms touchy-feely beliefs are not necessarily fact-based. Beliefs can become contrary to indisputable, or as I said them before, concrete, indisputable facts. Beliefs can even be seen as unreasonable. Beliefs are often based on the spiritually mystifying. I present to you as point one, God himself. Is the unbeliever is the unbeliever necessarily believing of a God that they can't see? Beliefs. These can be difficult to explain, even to our own acceptance. Here's my example. Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, Christians, all believe in God. Do all these different factions enjoy unity? Or do their quote-unquote beliefs cause disunity? Their shared belief in God should unify these groups, but their specific beliefs separate. Now, I could have broken that down even more. I could have gone just to the Christian population and shown that we have even more beliefs in common amongst one another. And yet, when we go to separate and individual belief systems, they cause disunity. That's all I meant by saying beliefs can create the very thing that should unify us, and it does, and cause unity, and it does, can also be the source or the contention creator. A few more examples. Explain an invisible God to an intelligent, reasonable unbeliever. Explain a merciful God to families of innocent war victims. Explain a loving God to families of natural disaster victims. Explain a kind God to mothers whose infants die suddenly. This is the disunity that I spoke of. Do these challenges that I offered above, a God who is loving, a God who is kind, a God who is generous, are you sometimes challenged by some of these dilemmas? This is when I said a disunity is stirred even within us. That's what I spoke of. Or at least that's what I was referencing, is a better way to say that. Naturally speaking, we identify differences in one another. It's just what we do. We identify our differences. We don't normally work hard enough to identify our shared commonalities. Muslims, Jews, remember what we talked about. Buddhists, Christians, all have a shared belief, but we immediately find our differences. We do that with one another as well. We don't look for the unity, we look for the disunity. It's just how we function. I was in Mexico doing church work 20 years ago, 30 years ago. I don't recall when it was, but I was in Mexico years and years ago, and I was up front speaking, and I did a little experiment. And I found this tall, handsome young man in the congregation. I asked him to come up front. And I put him beside me. And I mean, he was tall. He was 6'3" probably. I put him beside me, and we stood side by side. And I asked the congregation what they saw. Now, I want to begin by telling you they laughed first. The entire congregation began to laugh. And I don't think they were laughing at the tall, handsome young man that they knew. I think they were laughing at the stubby, short, stocky, old guy beside him, which the perfect reaction to my point happened. And then I asked them, what do they see? And through an interpreter, that question was asked, and then they answered, and they were shouting things out, and I didn't understand the thing they said, but he began to interpret for me, or for all of us who didn't understand. They said things like tall versus short. They said things old versus young. I'm sure that they said things about handsome versus whatever is next door to that. I just know that they were laughing and shouting things out and having a ball with this. And then I took that opportunity to name all the things that we shared in common. By nature, we see the differences in one another. We don't see the commonalities. And so even our beliefs, even when they're shared general beliefs, they have a tendency to disqualify us, to separate us rather than bring us together. Why? Because we find the differences. We know this now, and I hope you know it as well. Disunity is a natural reaction. It's easy, it's normal, it's what we do. Unity is a spiritual reaction. It's difficult and it's not normal. In fact, it's extraordinary. Not only is it not ordinary, it's extraordinary. So unity is an extraordinary miracle. Okay, let's discuss for a few slides, as I think was Annie Get Your Gun in the 1960s said, doing what comes naturally. So let's just see a couple facts about what we do by nature. Given our own devices, man will do this. Given our own emotions, given our own natural solutions, this is the mess that we cause in our relationships, in our interactions. The reason most arguments, disunity, most arguments keep going, maintain, continue forward, is a lack of mutual understanding. It's the absence of empathy. Last night I had a wonderful opportunity to meet with a young couple, and this is what we identified almost immediately. We saw this almost immediately. A lacking. There were some clashes happening, and we identified very quickly, or they did. I led them to them coming to this conclusion that there was a lacking of empathy. The lack of empathy leaves the individual who is lacking in a self-protected mode. Okay, they're cocooning. And this lacking usually manifests, watch this now, through judgmental behavior. Don't have the ability to see self, so they send all of that negativity out. They're just looking at the other person and judging. Results, bad feelings from both people. No unity. No apparent unity in this discussion or in this argument. Empathy is discarded, and what replaces that empathy are facts. Bottom line results or solutions. We go to facts. But those facts are our facts on our side of the room. We present our case from our truths, our reality, our facts. This is exactly the wrong place to begin resolving conflict. But that's where we go. And that's why those conflicts stay so long. Unending, meaningless conflicts filled with anger, filled with pride, filled with self-righteousness. They begin by identifying differences. We see that we're apart at some level. And then that normally happens through some type of attack or criticism. And then we take sides. And then both, hard-headed, clashing, purposed improving each other's or each person's truth. I'm going to make my case, and the person on the other side of the table is going to make their case over and over and over, back and forth. Neither listening to the other. As Brother Nick Yepko said, I think in last week or the week before, typed in real quickly, waiting for the other to stop talking so they can respond. No longer listening, just waiting with a response ready. That's what we do in our arguments. That's why we stay disunified. Most decide in advance that there is no compromise because I'm right. I have nothing to compromise. I'm right. You need to see my way. Most have one cause, one purpose only. They want the other to see their side. And this can be born. Watch this. Remember I said the irony is where we begin our walk with the Lord? We begin in dedication, in commitment, in obligation. Most of these clashes stay clashes because we begin most of our belief system most of our values in dedication, in commitment, in obligation. So we feel very right. How can two political parties be so far apart and both feel so very right? Dedication, commitment, obligation. How can four religions that believe in God be so far apart and feel so right? Dedication, commitment, obligation. Sermon years ago, I preached locally, and the theme was, what if you're wrong? And what I presented was, what if you're wrong about all that you believe? Why do you believe what you believe? Have you questioned everything and proven it so that you know without question you're right? Not just because you accepted a standard, not just because you accepted a set of beliefs, but because something strong happened. Remember what we talked about in our last study? That if you experiment upon someone's words, upon God's words, upon something that is so important to you, and God gives you a defined and specific answer, you no longer need faith for that particular subject. You don't need faith because it's now knowledge. So I asked the question, what if you're wrong? And it goes with this. This is what causes our disunity. Sometimes we're so set in our ways without reason other than someone told you. Why do I believe politically what I did? Probably because my parents did. And maybe that's all of us. And then after that, everything that I heard, I processed through my own filter, and it all proved that I'm still right. So that when I'm across the table from someone arguing and discussing, I'm right because of my values, my beliefs. These conflicts could be resolved faster and with more care if we would skillfully and generously utilize empathy, understanding the other person, listening to the other person. Empathy humanizes conflict. Rather than arguing, we're listening, we're processing, we're receiving. Rather than proving points, we're listening to the points being proven. But unfortunately, passion too often rules, and emotions frustrate. They cloud our judgment, they turn off our senses, and create a distance between the two parties. The will to be right is best done through a fight. And that's what we live for. And that's the rule we live by. Here's a real life that just took place situation, just today. And I'm going to use it with tongue firmly in cheek, but it's accurate too. This just took place. Yesterday was Cyber Monday. And for those who are late nighters, it was Cyber Monday all the way up till 3 a.m. in the morning Eastern time. So there were tremendous online sales. And again, for us late nighters, from 12 to 3, they got even better. Tremendous online sales. Somewhere around, well, let's just say sometime after midnight Eastern time, something else went on sale. It was the original 1970s Batman TV series, the complete series. Normally $80 on DVD, went on sale for $30. When presented to Candace this morning, she didn't quite see things the same way I did. She didn't quite see the value of my procuring this incredible gem. Possibly in her making her case, she might have used words like ridiculous. I'm not sure exactly what she said about this, but I think she did. The discussion sounded very much like the discussions we've had when I tell her about the artful direction in the Sharknado movies that she doesn't appreciate as well, or just as strongly. She doesn't appreciate the original Batman series. But anyway, instead of hearing her case, instead of hearing what she was saying to me, I just kept presenting my facts of why I thought this was such a great investment. And I wasn't listening. I was just making my case over and over and over again. And as you can probably guess, she's no closer to agreeing with this purchase than she was at the beginning. It certainly did not cause conflict. It just confirms the crazy that I'm possessed by with things like this. So having said that, my presentation was never one of empathy. It was always one of trying to counter with facts, and it got us no closer at all. For those who care, I'll probably watch the first season, first episode tonight after class. All right, what doesn't work in conflict resolution? Speaking more loudly than the other person, out shouting the other person. Sometimes we think that makes our case best. Bringing up evidence or facts, as I just told you, I kept continuing to tell her why this was such a fun thing to do. She never bought in, never bought in. I didn't listen to her and then present to her based on what she was saying. Just didn't. Now, this was not a big deal, but it was a great example to what I'm talking about. When things really are serious, what can happen in conflict? Presenting or speaking with a tone of urgency, like I've got to make this point right this very minute. Sometimes that causes interruptions, disturbances, this urgency that I have to prove my point right now to you. Refusing to let the topic drop. Continuing, without relenting, without surrendering, just continuing, pounding on the case. Even to the point that we follow one another around the house. The other person just wants to get away, and then someone follows the other one into the other room, just won't give up. None of those work for conflict resolution. This is why we're always at disunity in so many of our relationships. They continue when at least one person, one of the combatants, at least one of them is motivated by self-interest, selfish motivations. They're motivated by winning or making a point or feeling superior, smarter, the right one. They're perpetuated by divisive actions, meaning they're going to do what they want to do regardless. And frustrated by restrictive control, when one person has more power than the other and they use that power to control the other. This is more, this probably happens more in job settings with bosses, in family settings with parents, with children, and probably in some marriages with husbands and wives, when husbands are kind of still set in the 1950s, feeling more powerful than their wives. So again, why these things continue are all ineffective communication. It continues when motivation in at least one, if not both, one of the combatants is impure in their motivations. It takes two to fight, but it also takes two to resolve issues. Disunity comes without even trying. We found that last week. We found it in the country. We found it in the world. We found it in our communities. We found it in our neighborhoods. We found it in our homes. We found it in our one-on-one relationships, marriages that dissolve. Unity requires great effort, pushing against natural instincts, pushing against what comes naturally. Last week, we discussed what takes place in normal settings. This week, I hope you heard that we discussed why these things take place, the ineffective means that we use in conflict and in attempting to resolve conflict. In other words, attempting to win. This week, we discussed these things so that we get closer to doing what's right. I don't want any of you to believe for a moment that I'm making a case so that you don't believe that unity is possible. It's not to discourage you from even trying to unify. That's not the purpose of these classes. In fact, as Paul says in Romans, God forbid. This class is actually intended to point out the futility of our attempts made to create or recreate goodness on our own doing. It's impossible. All good comes from God. Believe that we're unable to unify without God's influence. Believe that. And allow this study to be the motivation that all of us beg him to help us. Because when he does, finally we will. When we invite him in to take the reins, we'll find unity. That's how close unity is for you and I. My case has been made to show you when given our own devices, when given into our own means and devices, when given into our own attempts, because often our attempts are self-centered, we will continue to fail. And so this entire class is based on trying something different, unnatural, trying something that will succeed, not just to attain unity, but hear this, even to maintain unity. That's my prayer for all of us. May the Lord bless each one of you. All right, so discussion points tonight. Maybe when we break off and we start sharing and